Today's demonstration is how to operate a vertical bandsaw. First thing we're going to talk about is safety. We're going to make sure we maintain an organized work area. Safety is a big thing that we talk about in a machine shop. Everything we do in here, there's moving parts, there's pinch points, and there's possible ways to hurt yourself. We have to avoid every situation we can think of before we work. So most importantly is maintain a clean and organized work area. As you can see, I come up to the saw. It is clean. That's the way we expect it to look when you are done. Machine hazards. Obviously with a saw, it's cutting something. There's usually a blade that moves, and the blade will run when the machine is on. When you feed the machine forward, the blade actually moves forward. So there's some obvious hazards included there. The blade is sharp, and if you have anything in the way of that blade, it will cut through it. It does not know the difference between human beings and materials. It'll cut whatever's in the vise. So make sure you keep all of your body parts away from there. Keep your shirts tucked in, and you do not wear gloves. I know it seems kind of strange that you don't wear gloves when you're dealing with a sharp machine, but if you wear a glove, that is something that'll get caught in the machine and it'll actually hurt you worse than if you didn't have a glove on. Material identification. One thing we do quite a bit in a machine shop is we cut different materials. It could be a low carbon steel or high carbon steel. And just looking at the outsides of the material, it's almost impossible to tell what it is unless they have labeled it. This one here, we have painted pink. The pink stripe indicates that when we purchased the material, we knew that it was a high carbon steel. This one here we know is a low carbon steel. Our material provider painted the end blue for us. Depending on what vendor you buy your material from, typically the blue is mild steel or green. Usually if they have red or yellow or orange, that is a high carbon steel. So it is important to know what the material is. One way to make sure that you always maintain material identification is to not cut the identification off. If I was to cut a piece off of here, I would remove it from this end. That way this end is still marked. After you saw the material, make sure we deburr it and put it away. This one here, the whole bar is painted orange or pink because we have a hard time keeping it identified. We know it's H13, which is a high carbon steel, but if the student would cut it off the wrong end, we would lose that identification. So what we do on all of our high carbon steels, they're all painted pink for the full length of the bar. This material is more expensive, more durable, and also harder on the equipment, so you have to run the right speeds and feeds. When we start talking about speeds and feeds, it's very important to know what material you're cutting. These are both steel. We also could cut aluminum, bronze, plastic, I guess possibly even wood with this saw. So it's very important to know what speed you're going to be running. What we're using today in our demonstration is going to be mild steel or A36. A36 is what you're going to be making your tool holder out of. So that's why we chose that for today's demonstration. When we start talking about materials, there are different blade speeds. So the speed of the blade is determined by the material you are sawing. Right here on this example, it says here A36 or structural steel. The blade speed should be about 225. That number is related to the number on this dial over here. This dial indicates blade speed. So this is only adjusted only when the saw is running. So if we have to set it to 225, first we'd have to start the saw. And I'm not ready to do that yet, so I'll show you how to do that once I get the saw running. The other thing that makes a difference is the size of the material. That determines your feed rate. And there's another chart over here that has a recommended feeds for your different shapes and sizes of your material. So make sure you follow that chart as well. It says up to 5 inches, somewhere between 30 and 60 pounds of force on the blade. Well, this is under 5 inches. It's actually quite a bit under, so I'm going to stay down around 30, maybe 40. And that would be indicated here. If you look, it says pounds, and it goes from 0 all the way to 140. So your bigger materials, you have to feed harder. Smaller materials, you feed a little lighter. This you adjust while the saw is not running. So I'm going to set that at 30. Let's talk about getting the material in the vise. We're going to talk about machine setup. If you look on your blueprint for your tool holder, it says on there to saw the material 4 1/4 inches long. So what you want to do is use this handle here. That brings the blade forward towards the material. You don't have to touch the material, but get close. And if you're going to measure for a certain size, we're looking for 4 1/4 inches. So you put your ruler up against the teeth on the blade. You don't want to measure to the vise jaw because that is actually further away from the blade. You want to measure to the blade. You slide your material out to 4 1/4, and you can then clamp the vise. Make sure you move the blade away from the material before you start the saw. Okay, operating the saw. There's really only 4 switches on here you need to worry about. One is labeled start. That one will start the saw. Stop stops the saw. The other one is labeled lamp off and on. Right now the lamp is on, lamp is off. And the other one is for coolant. While the blade runs, you will see a cutting compound known as coolant. It's a white milky looking fluid that's a mixture of oil and water. It cools the blade and lubricates the blade while it's cutting through the material. And that has 3 positions. It could either be auto, off, or on. And if you turn just the coolant on, only the coolant comes on. The blade is not running. If you have it off, it turns the coolant off. And if you switch it to auto, it'll automatically turn on when you start the saw. So those are the controls on the saw. Over here there is a feed lever. It's either in neutral or feed, and that's a 2-position lever. So that's for the power feed on the saw, and then this is the speed selector and the feed selector. This hand wheel moves the saw back and forth. So we're going to start the saw. You see the coolant comes on automatically. If the coolant did not come on, you need to turn it on to auto. Now I'm going to adjust my blade speed. If you remember on the chart it said 225. So if I turn the black knob, it actually changes the silver knob, and you can read the settings right on the silver knob. So about 225 is what we're looking for this blade with this material. Now if I move the handle over to feed, you'll see the handle starts to move and the blade is actually inching forward up towards the material. You can hear it when it starts cutting. So the blade is actually working its way through the material. Tooth by tooth on that blade, it's taking a little piece of material at a time, and at the same time the coolant is keeping everything cooled down. After the blade comes through the material, you hear the saw actually works a little easier and it's feeding faster because there's no resistance on the blade. So what you need to do then is put it back to neutral. Use the hand wheel to return the saw back all the way away from the vise, and then hit the stop button. That will stop the blade and the coolant. You can then remove the part that you just sawed, and then unclamp your vise and remove the material. That would be extra material. Now this also needs to be cleaned up and deburred, so when you put it back on the shelf, the next student doesn't have to worry about the sharp edges. If you look here now, where the blade came through, that actually left a wire edge all the way around the part. Those are known as burrs. We have to deburr that. In order to deburr that, you need to use a file or a belt sander. All right, so while deburring, if the part has sharp edges on there, I recommend that you hold it with a rag. And you just simply deburr the end of it. You take the file and you file the end of it to remove all burrs. So you want to make sure you deburr it so all the burrs are gone. We don't want anybody getting hurt handling this material. After you have it deburred, double check your dimension. Make sure it is the right size. Make sure you wipe off all the coolant and do the same thing with this one. Wipe it clean. Make sure you deburr the end that you've sawed. Just like I said in the start of the video, it's very important to keep everything clean and organized. So when you are done using the saw, make sure you wipe it down. Get rid of all the cutting fluid and all the metal shavings that were created during your operation. I know there are times when I come to the saw and it's not so clean. Try to clean it better than you found it. It's a very simple demonstration. If you have any questions before running the saw, please check with your instructor.